Thanks, John, and thanks to you and the committee for setting these up for the semester. Happy today to introduce Dr. Jacob Cooper. Jacob contacted me back in maybe late July. Just to introduce himself, he's a new assistant professor over at University of Nebraska-Kearney in the biology department there, and I invited him to come over to meet people. So appreciate those of you that have met with him today, and we've had him over at the museum. Hopefully that's all been good. But he has interest in birds, so that was why he was contacting me. But also kind of spatial stuff, but at a big kind of scale that I don't normally think about, kind of a biogeography scale. Ecology and evolution are in his bailiwick and things he's teaching over there. So has a University of, or Louisiana State University, Kansas, and University of Chicago are where degrees are from. But we're happy to have him here today and to learn more about what you're doing, Jacob. So thanks a lot.
All right, thanks so much. Is this working okay? Yes? All right. I can't really hear myself, so I just wanted to make sure. So yeah, today I wanted to talk about niche ecology, distributional ecology, and the diversification of vertebrate communities. And so a lot of this is based on the work that I did for my PhD, but also bridges over into some of the work I'm doing now. And I just wanted to mention that this is an adaptation of my job talk, so it covers a wide variety of research. I decided to keep this format for two reasons. One of them being I'm new to Nebraska, so I wanted to kind of talk about the stuff that I'm doing because I would really like to collaborate with people here. And the other one is because I'm teaching 3 new classes this semester, and I was asked to do this at the very beginning of the semester, and so this was the easiest way for me to get a talk together covering everything. So it does go over a lot. I'm going to start talking about the background a little bit and really covering some of the distributional ecology aspects, and then I was going to move more into sort of this bigger scale biogeography, and then end sort of talking about the Great Plains here in Nebraska, including work that I hope to start in Nebraska and work that I've been doing in Kansas as well. So when I talk about distributional ecology, I'm mostly talking about understanding why species live where they do and predicting their distributions. I'm specifically interested in using different methods to further understand the general theory of ecological niches and also the macroevolutionary dynamics of ecological niches in time and space. And so a lot of this is theoretical work that involves field work as well. Although I will say a lot of the stuff I've been doing lately, especially the past 3 years, has been theoretical, largely because of COVID and COVID restrictions. So when we talk about an ecological niche, really what we're talking about is sort of where the species fits into the environment, the conditions that it lives in, and where it can be found. So at a local level, the place of where a species can be found can be thought of as the niche. So we have here Cameroon sunbird feeding from what I believe is a type of lobelia in Equatorial Guinea, I believe. And so in this habitat, we have a species that is associated with other species it's co-occurring with. It is part of the same community. It has these interactions, and their distributions may be affecting one another. When we think about this at a regional level, however, the abiotic and biotic conditions necessary for survival are more what we focus on. And as we zoom out more and more, those biotic conditions actually sort of fall away in what we call sort of the Eltonian noise hypothesis, because the abiotic conditions, this sort of like hypervolume of conditions that cover all the places that the species occur, sort of start to take over. So for example, if we have a species that occurs in a certain landscape with certain rainfall and temperature, if there's some sort of biotic limiter, like a strain of malaria that it cannot survive, then it's not going to live in places that are suitable for that either. So we kind of pick up this biotic signal by looking at this bigger spatial signal as well with these abiotic characters. So when we really think about the determinants of species distributions, when we're starting to ask ourselves, okay, we know a little bit about the ecological niche, where's the species found? We can really break this down into 3 different categories. And this was first put forward by Jorge Soberon and Town Peterson at the University of Kansas. So we have biotic factors, which are shown here in this diagram as B. We have abiotic factors shown here as A, and then motility factors as well. So really where the species is occurring, sort of in the center of this diagram, are places where we have suitable biotic factors, so suitable biotic associations, where we have suitable abiotic factors, such as rainfall, and where the species can actually get to, so areas that are accessible. So importantly, we have this area that is just the biotic and abiotic areas that overlap. We can think of this as the invasible area. These are all the conditions under which a species could survive theoretically anywhere. And again, right here in the middle, we have that occupied area where the species is actually found because of these limitations. So a really good way to visualize this is to actually look at the map of the house sparrow. House sparrows are everywhere. I encourage you to go outside and look at them. They're quite neat, actually. But we can see here on this map in purple, we have the native distribution, sort of this occupied distribution from where it was originally found. And then we can see here in orange all the areas that has been introduced and it now survives. And so we can see these spatial patterns of where the species is found, where those habitats are that it's found. And then we can see that broader invasible area, all the environments that it could survive in, because this is the bird that has been taken to more places than basically any other bird on Earth. So one of the ways that we can model these distributions is by looking at what we call Hutchinson's duality. And so species distributions, we can approximate them from their occupied climatic space, and then species climatic space can then be used to estimate the distributions spatially. So for example, I have here points of eastern wood pewee in Nebraska, all the places it occurs, and then the gray dots are places that it has not been found where we have data from. And so we can look at this from an environmental perspective as well, in this case, looking at it in terms of temperature and precipitation. And then we can go back and say, where are places in Nebraska that fall into these temperature and precipitation regimes? Where are areas that could be suitable? So this is a very simple example of a niche model, but a really good example of how we can go back and forth between these factors. So a lot of the stuff that I've done has been accounting for motility restrictions as well in a lot of these models. So we're looking at these environments where the species occurs, but it's also important to really account for barriers that could be blocking where the species is getting to. So a lot of my master's work was looking at the motility restrictions for these different species, and it basically showed that failing to account for biogeographic barriers creates worse models. So you can see here in this diagram, I don't know if I have a laser pointer, do I? I should have checked that out before. Well, it doesn't work. But you can see here on this map, I have sort of purpley colors and I have pink colors. So these pinkish red colors are actually sort of a distribution model for the species if there's no spatial barriers taken into account, if we're just modeling the species for all the places it could occur. And then we can see here in blue and purple where it's overlapping, the places where we actually predict the species to be if we limit it to this geographic distribution shown by the dashed line. And importantly, we're cutting away all that stuff that occurs outside of that mountain range where we know that species isn't. But even when we look at these mountains, we find that we actually get a more precise estimation of where that species occurs by taking these geographic limitations into account. And importantly, when we look at this at a very, very big spatial scale, on this map, we basically have this black line as a perfect prediction. We have the blue line as predictions made inside geographically constrained areas, and the red line as being predictions made in unconstrained areas. We can see that making these geographic restrictions on these models can greatly improve our predictive ability on where species can be found. So including biogeographic breaks is very important. It's really important to restrict the data and take these biological aspects of different species into account. This is a demonstrated ability to help predict species composition. I talked to Rob about this a little bit earlier, but for some of these models, I actually, when I published this, I predicted species being somewhere and I said like, oh, that's a shame, this is a false prediction. And then people have later found the species at those places. So these models do have a predictive ability as well that can be improved by taking these different things into account. And importantly, looking at these things from these different perspectives can really help improve our methodology for using models such as this for conservation and research. So one of the questions that I've had that comes out of this as well is if we're looking at these geographic restrictions and everything for these species, can we create better models that can help us identify areas of species overlap and help look at areas of hybridization? And if we choose the correct model path, can this really help us understand potential or observed species interactions in geographic space? And this is something I'm particularly interested in, being in Nebraska, sort of halfway between east and west, and in the contact zone for lots of different mammals and birds. But the one example that I've really looked at so far from this perspective is this hummingbird. Specifically, this is a novel hybrid hummingbird that was found. It wasn't sure really what it was for a really long time. We had to do genetic work to figure out what this is. Well, the royal we, my colleagues had to do genetic work to figure out what this is. But we have this novel hybrid with a novel throat color in this species of hummingbird in South America. And our question was, we found this species in an area, but is that the area we would actually expect it to be? And we were able to show that if we do ecological niche models, if we look at the distributions of these species, that yes, where this hybrid is actually makes sense for where we would expect to find it. So you can see on the map here, we have one species shown in purple, one species shown in the sort of blue-green. We have the hybrid there in that pinkish orange. So it's geographically intermediate, but as we can see in the PC plot as well, that orange point is sort of towards the middle of the environmental space too. So this hybrid is occurring in an area that is both geographically intermediate, but also environmentally intermediate, where we would expect or could predict these species to come into contact. So these modern day distributions can teach us a lot about the species' ecological requirements and potential distributions. This can help us understand where hybridization could occur, where these species are coming together. But another question that comes into play is like, what does this tell us about niche evolution? So for example, in that previous example, these species occur in very similar ecological niches. They seem to be geographically separated mostly, but can we actually make inferences about niche evolution through time using methods such as this? So usually when we look at niche evolution, we're talking about niche conservatism. This is our null hypothesis for many of these situations. So being adapted to a niche at a broad landscape scale is a stable state. Those are the conditions in which you can live. And it seems to be difficult to niche switch. And there's a lot of evidence that seems to support this as well. So when we reconstruct niches, this is sort of what we're looking at. We're looking to see if conservatism is basically being violated, if we're seeing a shift in niche condition in these species. And so we can look at different species to try to see if species that have different distributions, different sort of geographic distributions have these different niches. And so one of the examples we looked at was the genus Ampelion. Ampelion is a group of two cotingas that live in the Andes. And what's really interesting is that one of them is discontinuous. It basically has a break between Colombia in the north, shown in blue, Peru in the south, also shown in blue, whereas the sister species in pink occurs continuously across that entire area. And so even though these birds have quite different ranges and they seem to be restricted to different areas, we find that we do see conservatism of niches. They don't have statistically different niches. They seem to be conserved, even though they're displaying very different patterns in the geographic landscape. So if we decide to look at this through time, we know that species niches, they should not be correlated because we have these independent evolutionary trajectories, but at the same time, we should have conservatism occurring through time as our null hypothesis. And so we can look at species that co-occur. They might have non-identical niches, but the question is like, how are they evolving? How are these niches changing? And are they really completely changing the ecological conditions under which they live? So before I really get into that, I wanted to also touch on this idea of the cycle of speciation. So we have these niches that are changing through time. We also have these species that are changing through time. So something that was really put forward by Ricklefs and other researchers in the Caribbean is that we have ranges and niches that theoretically expand and contract through time. The idea is that we have allopatry, these populations becoming isolated, these populations splitting up. We have this diversification occurring, and then through time, we basically just have repeated cycles of this that can help build diversity. So from a niche perspective, do we see the same thing? Was sort of a question that I had. So we have species that have very, very broad ecological niches, as shown here in blue. This is Prognathe calabea. The photo is actually a purple martin, which breeds here in Lincoln. I included a photo of a purple martin because almost all the martins look the same. Many of them are extremely difficult to identify. Looking at them, some of them you have to genotype. So they're very morphologically conserved. They're very phenotypically conserved. But we have species that have vastly different distributions. So we have one here, calabea, that occurs across the tropics. We have Sinaloa, which is only found in the highlands of Mexico when it breeds. And then we have these allopatric populations that are in the Caribbean as well. And so what we find is actually when we look at the niche distribution of all of these things, we see that there's actually not a lot of changes that happen in these niches. Usually what we see is actually retraction. So this seems to line up fairly well with that idea of the cycle of speciation, where we have populations that expand out. In this case, we have calabea, which is actually the outgroup to all these more specialized taxa, has a very, very broad geographic distribution, has a very, very broad ecological niche. And then we see this sort of cycle of speciation, if you will, with these ecological niches, as these populations and species are becoming more specialized in the areas that they are, sort of by losing niche space, not necessarily by shifting their ecological niche. So as a conclusion for all of this, taking biogeographic barriers into account really improves our niche modeling performance. We find a lot more evidence for ecological niche conservatism and patterns similar to taxon cycles when we look at the ecological niche evolution and look at these patterns of conservatism. But another avenue of research that really interests me is sort of the biogeographic dynamics that kind of go behind this and the way that biogeography might be affecting these individual species versus these entire species assemblies. So with that, I'll go on to my next sort of big avenue of research, which is the biogeography of these groups. So specifically, I'm really interested in how taxa diversify across geographic areas and in isolated regions. I'm really interested in researching the ways in which communities can and cannot teach us about regional evolution and regional ecology. And I'm really interested in identifying and studying regions of endemism in order to understand how ecology and geography drive evolution, and also to understand areas that require more research in the future. I will say that a lot of this research was done at the Field Museum. For those of you who've been there, you probably met John Bates. He's one of the curators of birds there. This is him on a boat in South Georgia, being very happy to be there. I think he had just skinned a rotting penguin, so I think he's just happy to be done with that. But really, really great guy, and I owe a lot of this work. I want to thank him for helping me with a lot of this work. So when we look at biogeographic patterns of diversification, some of the really common patterns we see, if we have a theoretical state where we have a geographic distribution, here shown as this purple blob, and we have a ecological niche shown as the more round blob, this hypervolume in space, we have many different ways in which diversification can occur. We have parapatric diversification, where species seem to subset parts of the ancestral range, and they subset parts of the ecological niche of the ancestor, sort of that cycle of speciation that we talked about. We have situations where we have allopatric speciation, where the populations become separated, but we can have very similar ecological niches in that case. That does not necessarily mean that we have evolution occurring. And then we also have parapatric niche shifts that occur more rarely, where a species will change its distribution and change its niche. And this seems to be rare. And when we look at lots of examples, the most common one that we see is that we have allopatric diversification with non-differentiation of these niches, with niche conservatism. So given that we have niche conservatism, given that this seems to be the expectation, we can look at past climate cycles to try to understand how populations have changed through time and how they've gotten to the places where they are. So climatic cycles are very well known in the Northern Hemisphere for fracturing distributions. And as shown in this image, we can see this sort of maximum ice potential across the Northern Hemisphere is this light gray color. And indeed, this is part of what has really influenced the geography of the Great Plains as well. So when we look at this for the tropics, though, from a more tropical perspective, these ice ages have actually led to really drastic changes in local environments in different places. And so we can see here at the top during the last glacial maximum, we had very, very limited areas of closed forest predicted to be around the world. Whereas during the early Holocene, these forests greatly expanded. And at present, we have a wider distribution as well. We have a lot more deserts popping up, such as the Sahara. And we see a lot of evidence for this, not just like in the fossil record and everything, but we even have, drawings from people several thousand years ago in what is now the Sahara that show fauna that were associated with a much wetter place. And we even have these relic forests in some parts of places like the Sahara as well that attest to these changes. And so if we look at these past climate changes in the tropics, we can see that climatic cycles actually create corridors of habitat that connect these different regions. So as these cycles occur, as these forests expand and contract, we're actually connecting and disconnecting different parts of these habitats. And so this has resulted in repeated isolation connectivity and has allowed for diversification in allopatry and then secondary contact when these species come back together. And so Afromontane taxa in particular have experienced a lot of range retraction since the last glacial maximum. And we actually show this here. This is a paper we did on a lot of different vertebrate species and a lot of different plant species found across Africa, where you can see at top the present distribution of a lot of these taxa. You can see in middle, the mid-Holocene distribution, at bottom, the last glacial maximum predicted distribution. And importantly, as we go back to the last glacial maximum, you can see that more and more areas are predicted to be suitable for these species that are presently restricted to basically high mountaintops. And so this has resulted in a really, really interesting situation where you have species that are virtually identical, populations that are virtually identical in mountain ranges that are sometimes separated by thousands of kilometers across lowland rainforest and lowland desert. So when we look at all these areas individually in Africa, Africa is where I've done a lot of my biogeographic work, we see that we basically have three major montane areas that fall out that are connected. For those of you that are wondering about Ethiopia, Ethiopia is kind of its own thing. It's been really, really isolated for a long time. Most of the connections we see are actually between West Africa, East Africa, and the Angolan highlands. And so we see lots of different species, such as this Sylvia abyssinica, this African hill babbler. It's actually a warbler, not a babbler, but that's a story for another time. So we have this species that's found across all of these different highlands in all of these different areas. But when we look at the morphological variation that these populations exhibit, we get really, really complex patterns. So if you were to group these populations together just based on morphology, we see here that we have 3 different populations in West Africa, for example, 2 of which are only found on isolated mountains or islands. And then we have birds in northern Cameroon that seem to be phenotypically identical, morphologically indistinguishable from birds thousands of miles away in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we see the same pattern in different populations as well, such as for the ones in Angola. And these really attest to those connections, but they also illustrate that it seems like there's been a very complicated pattern of connection across a lot of these different mountains. So one of the classic examples to me about this is the Cinereus reichsonii, the northern double-collared sunbird. This is a classic example of a convoluted distribution. This is a bird that I've always really enjoyed. And when I first went to the Field Museum, I noticed a species with an oddly golden plumage, and it had a subspecies label that I did not recognize, this genderuensis, which turned out to be a subspecies that just stopped being recognized in the 1950s, 1960s, because it was too confusing. But looking at this one bird, to me, seemed pretty obvious. And you can see here that there's actually birds with short bills and birds with long bills. And I'll point out that one of those short-billed birds is from Kenya, one of them is from Cameroon, and both the long-billed birds are from Cameroon, just a few dozen or a few hundred kilometers away. So when we look at this distribution at a big scale, my colleagues, Kelly McKay, John Bates, and Dylan Maddox and I, we obtained genetic samples of these birds from throughout the distribution. We obtained the records shown in blue from basically the high wet areas of Cameroon, the areas shown in red, which were these interior mesic areas of Cameroon, and the areas shown in black, which were the eastern parts of the distribution. And we can see here as well a distribution model behind it for this species. We have lots of reports for the eastern population, so it's sort of an over-prediction of where it could occur. This may be because it's a lot of citizen science data that isn't necessarily restricted to highland habitats. But we can see for those Western populations that we have these very restricted distributions predicted that are in those areas. And we do see this giant gap between these populations. And so when we look at these from a genetic perspective, we find that the Eastern birds actually serve as the outgroup for the Western birds, which seems to suggest a single colonization event from East Africa to West Africa, and indeed all the other relatives of this group, such as Regius shown here in golden, they're all East Africans. This is mostly an East African radiation, where this is the only one that has made it to the West. But if we look at this from morphology, we actually see that one population in the West, specifically that red population, is actually more morphologically similar to birds in the East than it is to birds found in the highlands, just sometimes a few dozen kilometers away. So it seems like we have this situation where these species have split up and they've gone across the continent, and we have one population that is starting to diverge a little bit in terms of environment, in terms of where it is occurring, and another population that is starting to diverge in terms of its morphology, but it's still maintaining those high elevation mountains. And I will say that in line with the theory of niche conservatism, we don't find any significant differences between the ecological niches of these species, but we do find these morphological trends occurring across these different populations. And so these Western and Eastern populations, they are allopatric, but they have similar niches, kind of like this example C that we talked about. But the Western populations appear to be in the process of diversifying parapatrically, even though they're not wholly divergent ecologically, like example B. So we have lots of different examples. This is not like a one-off. There's actually several dozen species that show this distribution pattern. Several of the species found in East Africa that have these fractured montane distributions are shown here. And so we're looking right now to combine data from multiple species to look at aggregate patterns of evolution between all of these species. And this will hopefully shed light on the common factors that affect the diversification of these communities and that have led to these distributions. And this is something that we're still currently working on. We do have some preliminary data, especially from mitochondrial data and everything. This is from my dissertation, where we see that lots of common patterns emerge. And perhaps one of the most interesting common patterns that we found in all of these species is we have here a series of ecological niche models where we see red as a future prediction of where that species should occur about 50 years from now. We have blue, which is sort of an ice age prediction of the distribution, and we have black, which is the modern current distribution. So we see that this distribution will become more fragmented through time, but we do have some genetically really isolated populations. And so you can see here on the haplotype network, even though these mountains are extremely fractured and will continue to be fractured, even though we have places like the Ruwenzori in the far north that have always been isolated, seem to never be connected. All of these places are very closely related to each other, except for one mountain in the south called Mount Kabogo. And so Mount Kabogo is a very isolated region, and time again, we find that it seems to be genetically isolated when all these other mountains that are not differentiated are still isolated as well. So we have lots of isolated mountains, but the only one that seems to be diversifying is this Mount Kabogo. So to look at these overall patterns of evolution, I worked with an undergrad at the University of Chicago named Melazine Veldi. We went to Costa Rica and we did some surveys of community dynamics in Costa Rica. We gathered a lot of data from online, and we wanted to understand, we have all these common distributions from all these species. In theory, they should all have their independent evolutionary trajectories. Is that actually what we see in species that co-occur in the modern day as well? And so we got a lot of data from online. This is a program called EcoStructure, which is basically doing structure diagrams for populations. And we were trying to determine whether or not species that occur together at one time of the year are predicted to occur together at another time of the year. And just like we saw with the mountains, how we have all these different patterns, every species is unique. There are common patterns, but everyone seems to have its own evolutionary trajectory. We see the same thing for a lot of these communities in places like Costa Rica, where these communities are not maintained throughout the year. Each species seems to be doing its own thing, sometimes switching from one community to another. And the only places where we really see any sort of stability are places that are really ecologically unique, such as the Paramo, these areas up a tree line that are very habitat specific and very geographically isolated. So these shared patterns, this is another ecostructure diagram, this time for East Africa. When we look at these shared patterns, they can shed light on the interconnectedness of some of these specific montane regions. They can show the distribution of different montane blocks. So we can see here, for example, we have these different colors representing different montane areas, and we have sort of these core montane areas, but we also have these fringe ranges that seem to be the areas where things can colonize from both directions, where we're starting to get the secondary contact locally in some of these geographic areas. And this really highlights that we have transition ranges and core ranges for a lot of these species that are geographically moving around, but also that all these species are moving around independently, and we see common community patterns, but we don't see things moving en masse together between these different areas. So these shared patterns, they can really help us clarify geographic boundaries of biodiversity hotspots. They can help us get new predictions of sort of where we would expect things to be more closely related. And they give us a framework in which we can test a lot of these relationships and look at these genetic relationships for individual species to understand what conforms to the overall patterns that we see for the bigger communities and what species seem to be going against these patterns and what might be different about those species. So we can also zoom out even further, though, if we want to talk about these communities. We're looking at individual areas, we're looking at mountains, but we can even look out further to see how things are diversifying at the continental level. So the main thing that we looked at was we looked at birds and mammals in Africa. The very top map here is showing species richness for both these groups in Africa. So you can see there's similar patterns of richness. The second one here is showing mean phylogenetic distance between the different organisms here. And the last one is showing mean nearest taxon distance. And if we transform these data to look at phylogenetic dispersion, so basically looking at the way that these communities are structured, we find that we have lots of communities that are less related than we would expect based on the data shown here in yellow. We have lots of species that are more related than we would expect, shown here in blue. And these areas, when I first looked at them, I realized they looked familiar to me. They looked kind of like an ecoregion map. And sure enough, if we bin these data based on ecoregion, we actually find that mostly dry xeric areas seem to be less related than we think. And a lot of wet areas or climatically stable areas seem to be more related than we think. And so a lot of times these patterns spatially coincide with what we call refugia. I really wanted to see if this was the case or there could be something else going on. But it seems like these observable patterns could also be explained by reduced extinction alone. So the idea of these refugia is that we have these stable areas that these populations are able to persist through time. And using theoretical models, such as the ones behind me for mean phylogenetic distance, I was able to show that if you just have the same conditions in two different areas, but you alter those extinction rates, you have an area with reduced extinction, you can get the same results that we see at these continental patterns. So it does seem to be that these refugia are helping species persist, and they're actually shaping the communities that occur in these areas, allowing more related taxa to basically co-occur and to stack up in these areas, more so than we see in a lot of these climatically less stable. In Africa, they happen to be xeric regions. So in terms of biogeography, it appears as though taxa diversify independently, although there are shared patterns that illuminate a lot of these biogeographic barriers and help illustrate the history of these regions. We have a lot of individual taxa that undergo complex patterns of diversification, including through allopatry and parapatry. And we have a lot of regions, such as Mount Kabobo, that have under-recognized diversity and require a lot more research and more conservation action. And I will say too, Mount Kabobo is a very isolated region. It is not a region that is visited by scientists from institutions very often. So the last thing I want to talk about today, this is sort of the place that I'm going now. I'm now at the University of Nebraska-Kearney, as you've heard, and I'm starting to look more into things in the Great Plains to research as well, especially things to research with students. And so a lot of our Great Plains work has started involving looking at different sort of resurvey sites and looking at areas that are historically well known. I want to point out that some of this work that I've done, I did with Renee Martin, who some of you might recognize. She's going to be starting here as an ichthyology professor next fall. So she has been involved in this project as well. And this is something that I hope to collaborate with her on in the future too. So the things that we're currently working on, the Great Plains, my colleagues and I, we're working to actively document and describe distributional shifts in North American birds to look at how the plains have changed over the past 100 to 150 years. We're working towards documenting and resurveying the Great Plains, specifically identifying places that are historically very well known. And we're looking to explore a lot of these hybrid zones and peripheral populations, thinking about the ecological niches, trying to predict where these hybrid zones might be occurring, looking at how these hybrid zones are shifting, and trying to understand how biogeography might be shaping these hybrid zones in the Great Plains. And so here in Nebraska, we have a lot of places that look like this, the Platte River Valley, sort of just outside of Kearney, which is a really, really nice area. But a lot of these places have changed through time and now look a lot more like this. So this is a lot better for my dog. She likes this a lot more. She doesn't really like going through the tall grass. But from a biodiversity perspective, this is quite different. And so a lot of times we focus on the grasslands, we focus on the grasslands that have been lost. But one of the other things to consider is how much the forested habitats have changed as well. So here we have an image of the Platte River near Kearney in the 1950s. I'm not yet familiar enough with the area to tell you exactly where this is. But if we look at images from a similar area in the present day, we see that this structure has completely changed. And so it makes it really clear why species such as least tern, piping plover are all endangered species in Nebraska in the present day, because we used to have all of these sandbars, we used to have all these open areas where they could nest, and these have now been largely replaced by these big forested corridors, habitats for other species that occur in these plains. And so coinciding with this, with the fire suppression, with the expansion of forest, we see a lot of shifts that occur in species distributions as well. So this is the distribution of the barred owl according to Ebert from 1901 to 1953. And I did look it up. That record from Bermuda seems to be a real record. It's the only barred owl ever seen on Bermuda, which is pretty crazy. But as we move forward into the future, we see that this range has actually greatly expanded. So this is the distribution of the species just from this year. And so this species has basically taken over the Pacific Northwest. It is trying to outcompete and push out the endangered spotted owl, which is a huge conservation issue. And it seems to be expanding further and further south into California, further into Wyoming. And it might not be too long before the species even starts showing up in the Colorado Rockies. So these habitat changes have really facilitated the expansion of a lot of species that benefit from these wooded habitats. So I want to include this as well, just because I think it's a really, really interesting example, another parallel example. It's not just things like barred owl, even things like northern cardinal, which we might take for granted. This is the first bird I saw parking outside this building this morning when I got here. This is a bird that we take for granted and seems to occur everywhere. But something we don't realize is that northern cardinals were unknown in Ontario until 1849, which is disturbingly recent. They only first nested in Canada in 1901, and now they're common residents basically as far north as Montreal. So habitat shifts, and it appears as though climate change probably plays into this a little bit as well, have been really altering the distributions of birds in eastern North America, and especially on the Great Plains. One of the issues we experience with studying these birds, though, is that it's really hard to describe and quantify a lot of these distributional shifts. It's really easy to look at the literature and everything, but it's another thing to try to understand exactly how it's changing. So one of the things we've been looking into is how to create plots to analyze potential distributions, to look at distribution shifts, to understand exactly what is going on in these different situations. So this is an example with the Carolina wren, which is another bird that is common here in Lincoln. It's not common in Kearney, although I wonder if it will increase in the near future. We can do lots of different distribution models for this species. And actually for this particular one, I had data basically from 1970 to 2017 from breeding bird surveys, Christmas bird counts, eBird, GBIF, all of that stuff. I created a niche model for every single year, for every single winter, summer season. And then we can look at these all together to try to understand where these species occur. And so you can see here on the left, this is sort of a cumulative distribution of the species. These are the areas that has occurred year after year after year. I do want to point out that there are areas in the South that have lower levels of occurrence. A lot of these actually refer to rural areas such as Mississippi and stuff like that, areas that people just don't go to very often where we don't have consistent data collection. So a lot of these really extreme places, such as really, really hot and humid places in the South, also show sort of reduced prediction. But in other areas where we have better sampling, such as the Great Plains, we're seeing a real pattern of sort of this reduced prediction as we get across the plains. But in terms of how we correlate this, how we look at this through time, two of the methods that we've been looking into are looking into concave hulls. So concave hulls fit a shape around all of the points, but they allow for indentation. So we can see here on the right, two different concave hulls. The dotted line basically represents the externalmost points for Carolina wren in 1970 in the summertime. And then that solid line is the externalmost points in 2017 in the summertime for that same species. So we can see a large expansion in terms of that. We can see the way that this pattern shifts through time. But we can also look at the areas in which the species is unstable. So I've been calling it here interannual variance. I'm sure there's a better term for it. But basically, instead of looking at the average occupancy in a single cell, we can look at the average occupancy between years and get a metric of how unstable a specific place is for a species to occur. And so this map on the right, all these areas that are very, very bright, these are areas of instability. These are areas where if you have it one year, you're more likely to not have it the next year. If you don't have it one year, you're more likely to have it the next year. And we see that these areas of instability correspond to the expansion of the hull on the Great Plains, to the expansion of the species across the Great Plains as it's moving. But we see that this also corresponds to the Northeast, where it seems like really harsh winters and weather conditions have been knocking the species back. And importantly, this is something that we're still looking into the best ways to quantify and everything. But we can see in the North, it seems to be sort of a thinner band of this instability, whereas in the West, it's a very broad band, which corresponds with what we've been reading in the literature about these species expanding with habitat change in the West, but being weather limited at the northern part of their distribution and only shifting as winters become more mild. And again, this is just a zoomed in version of that map to really make it clear that in the Great Plains, we have this really, really big swath sort of in the center of this instability that corresponds pretty well with that hull. The other thing I want to point out, though, is that these are models. There are things that we need to improve. This is based on only about 4 variables. So you do see that there's some areas outside of the hull that look like they're environmentally suitable for this species. And time will tell if, as the habitat changes, as more woods come in and everything, if the species starts to move into those areas, or if these are models that need to be improved in some way. So in line with this, in line with how things are changing, the University of Kansas has been starting a Great Plains resurvey project. This is one of the projects I was involved with as a postdoc there. So these distributions continue to change. And as they change, they need to be documented. So the University of Kansas is working on documenting these through specimens and also through visual observations, photographs, other forms of physical documentation. So we've been revisiting sites all across Kansas. So every single one of the sites you see with a star behind me in Kansas is basically a site that was extremely well surveyed before 1940, I believe, for some form of vertebrate group. And we're actually looking into expanding this across the entire Great Plains to document just how much the avifauna has been changing across this entire region, and also just how much the mammals and other organisms have been too. I'm an ornithologist, I forget sometimes. So when we look at the Great Plains, they represent a really phenomenal natural laboratory. For me, they're also really interesting because a lot of people who do what I do, they focus on mountains in these areas where we have very, very clear-cut environmental differences, very clear-cut habitat differences. These are things that are much harder to study in more homogeneous landscapes where the gradients occur across much larger spatial scales. But we seem to have these species expanding across the plains. They're showing a directional expansion in some areas, not directional expansion in other areas. And again, more work like this is needed in places like the plains to really understand the dynamics of these species changing through time. So with that, I just kind of want to go over the main points again. The interaction of geography and environment through time seems to shape species evolutionary histories. There's many different ways we can see this, many different ways we can demonstrate this. Species that have similar patterns in similar areas, but the evolutionary trajectories of these seem to be independent, and this may provide something against which we can compare, but it's not something that we should use as necessarily a complete expectation for all these, since they are evolving independently. We have more support for niche conservatism, especially through all these different examples. And even when we have species that seem to be evolving in terms of their niches, sometimes it's actually like a cycle of speciation, where things are just partitioning their niches or starting to occur in different areas, parapatrically or allopatrically. We also see that suppression of extinction rates and through climate change, suppression of extinction rates through climatic stability can result in macroevolutionary patterns in some of these communities that we observe. So, such as these areas of really closely related populations in some of these rainforests, these less related communities in these xeric areas. And a lot of continued work is necessary to understand dynamics of areas such as the Great Plains that have a lot of spatial and temporal variation across really large scales. And again, I'm really excited to be here. This is a really neat natural laboratory. It's pretty different from working in places like Central Africa, where I've worked in the past. But I have to say, I've been to the Sandhills many times, and I'm really excited for future collaborations and future work in this area. With that, I really want to acknowledge there's a lot of different tribes and chieftains who gave us permission to work on their land. I've also gotten permission from a lot of different landowners for access and assistance, basically in every country I've ever worked, and a lot of different local governments provided a lot of paperwork for this work as well. So a lot of this work was funded by the KU and Haskell Indian Nations University Iraqta program and the University of Kansas Biodiversity Institute. And a lot of this work is also based on work done at the Field Museum. And I specifically really want to thank Eric Fokum from the University of Boya in Cameroon, who's been a great collaborator, and also folks who did a lot of this work at the Field Museum, such as Tom Noski, Charles Cahindo, Ben Marks, and Josh Engel. Also, thanks Larkin for having me here. Again, these are my main funders and everything. I'm at the University of Nebraska-Kearney now. I'm excited for it, and I'm really looking forward to getting to know Nebraska better. So with that, I think I can take any questions. So.
Thanks, Jacob. We've got time for questions, and I can bring the microphone around. So we've got people online too. Okay. Mark Pegg has a question.
Oh, okay.
Well,
thank you for your presentation. So in terms of like an action for your research or like a direct application area, especially at the coarseness of your species maps and the general biodiversity trends and climatic trends that you were talking about, do you think there's a place for it within the 3030 or the Half Earth program or the UN Biodiversity program in terms of actually looking for that, driving towards climatic stability while also preserving ecosystems on a much more coarser level, or at least targeting the areas and mapping them? Thank you.
Okay, yeah. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not familiar with all of those programs, so I'll try to answer it as best I can. But yeah, I see this as a really good way to sort of look at the species that we have here and now to try to understand what their current distributions are, to try to understand if there's areas where we aren't seeing them. But also we can use these models to help understand areas where these species might occur in the future. And so specifically in montane regions and stuff, you can do sort of like predictive conservation, where you can try to understand where these communities might be occurring. And for a place like Nebraska, this could be really interesting because there could be very limited pockets of habitat or microhabitats where some of these species occur. So like I was just talking earlier today about some of the Ice Age relic fish, for example, in the sandhills and stuff like that. And so using models like this, we might be able to see what other things might become more spatially restricted and stuff in the future. So this could help planning for future conservation. And you're talking about like all these efforts to sort of help with climate change, slow down climate change, but also there is going to be some sort of new equilibrium in the future. Unless somebody invents like a perfect carbon capture device, it's very unlikely that we're going to go back to like the 1950s or something like that in terms of climate. And so these models can help us understand as well what those new dynamics might look at, both at the species level and the community level in all of these different areas. Does that answer everything? Okay. Yeah.
given that the plains are kind of this mixing pot where you got distributions that kind of come together at the core or edge, a lot of times at the edge, a lot of different species, they kind of, they're hit or miss, and you kind of hit on that a little bit. Does it make more sense to look at some of these distribution models from just a functional life history strategy type perspective, where you can look through time to see what life history strategies can be conserved? It's kind of like, it's a different one. Instead of just the species, but more of just like life history, like how many eggs do they lay and stuff.
So that could be something really interesting to look into. That's not something that I personally have looked into before. We've just kind of picked a couple of random species to look at here that kind of encompass a wide range of life histories. But I mean, yeah, that can really get at sort of how quickly a species might be able to adapt to these different regions. So I'd be really curious if you compare this to life history, you might see that something that has larger clutch sizes or something like that might actually expand across this area a lot faster than something that doesn't. That'd be a really cool thing to look into.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. My name is Shabani Muller. I'm interested in knowing the results about Mount Kabogo. First of all, is it the mounds that is located along Lake Tanganyika?
It is, yeah.
Yes, that's where I'm from. I grew up, along Lake Tanganyika. So I want to know what is so special that bear from this area are different from others.
So it seems like Mount Kabogo, it's really interesting because when you do modeling too, Mount Kabogo seems to be more peripheral, more marginal for a lot of these species that are actually seem to be common there based on field surveys. So because of where it's located along the lake, it seems to have a different microclimate than a lot of these other mountain regions. So these other mountain regions, they're not necessarily right next to a giant Great Lake. So they have sort of drier areas, they have wetter tops. But we see sort of like an extension of these habitats down lower, it seems like, on this area. And I know that there's like a unique forest type on top as well. But yeah, it seems like almost every species we look at, we have very, very distinct genetic groups on that mountain. And what's really cool is that one of the few ones that shows some sort of variation between there and other places, it is a genetically distinct haplotype group, I think, from, looks like it might have come from there and then spread to some other, like there's a distinct group there, and then it looks like we have other haplotype groups that have spread out in the area. But yeah, repeatedly for every single species, we do not see, even across like the Great Rift between like Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we very rarely see like perfect partitioning or anything. We usually see at least one or two individuals have crossed back and forth, which given our sample sizes suggests that probably happens fairly regularly. But for many, many species, we see Mount Kabogo as being different. And for many of these species, we actually see differences that are enough that we should probably elevate them to species rank. So it seems to be a combination of the climate there, the habitat there, and then also this isolation that like, I personally think that the climate might be one of the things that might be driving this, if it is sort of a different microclimate and everything, because places like the Ruwenzoris are a lot more connected to like Kahuzi Biega and stuff. But that's my thought. I really want to look into that a little bit more. It's something I haven't been able to quite wrap up yet from my PhD, and we're hoping to run some whole genome and UCE stuff on those species to get a better idea of what demographically is happening in that region.
Excellent. You should come back again.
Yeah, thanks.
Anybody else?
I also want to thank my parents. They showed up today. I didn't think that was going to happen. So, yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'll be around for a bit if anybody wants to talk. And Kearney's only like 2 hours away. Y'all should come visit. So.